Welcome to Outside Views, where we take an in-depth look at the obstacles the UK would face if it ever were to apply for EU membership again. Brexit is increasingly regarded as a mistake, and many Britons now favour joining the EU again. But what would that actually mean? Today we continue our BRITURN series, where we explore the challenges of the accession process. In this episode we examine Chapter 33, Financial and Budgetary Provisions. When discussing the prospect of the UK joining the European Union again, we must understand that there is no shortcut or special treatment for a former member. The UK would have to apply like any other country, and that means fulfilling the so-called Copenhagen criteria. And these criteria demand stable democratic institutions, a functioning market economy, and the ability to adopt the entire body of EU law known as the acquis. Every applicant follows the same process, meaning this is not a negotiation in the way many would assume because of the name. The EU does not bargain over its rules. The applicant country must align with them. And Chapter 33 deals with financial and budgetary provisions, a crucial aspect of EU membership. And this chapter governs how a member state contributes to the EU budget and ensures it has the administrative structures necessary to collect, process and transfer funds correctly. This is not an area where opt-outs or special arrangements will be granted, as all members must contribute fairly and proportionally to the EU's financial system. The cherry-picking times are over. The EU budget is funded through a system of own resources, which are mainly composed of three categories. The first is traditional own resources, which include customs duties and agricultural levies. The second is a resource based on value-added tax or VAT, where a small percentage of VAT collected by member states is contributed to the EU budget. The third and most significant is a contribution based on gross national income or GNI, which ensures that wealthier nations contribute more, while poorer nations contribute less. For the UK, this would mean joining the common financial framework and making substantial contributions to the EU budget, but not on a red bus. Before Brexit, the UK was a major net contributor to the EU budget, and while it received some funding in return, particularly for agriculture and regional development, its overall financial contribution was still higher than what it received back. And that's fair, but it was not that what's on the bus. And this was a key argument for Brexiteers who claimed that leaving the EU would allow the UK to redirect its contributions to domestic priorities, which they never did. However, joining the EU again would mean returning to these financial commitments without any rebate like the one the UK had negotiated before Brexit. A major challenge for the UK in fulfilling this chapter would be demonstrating that it has the administrative capacity to collect, calculate and transfer its financial contributions according to EU standards. Since Brexit, the UK has developed independent customs and taxation policies, some of which diverge from EU requirements. For instance, the UK no longer collects customs duties on behalf of the EU, and it has introduced changes to VAT collection, particularly regarding e-commerce and trade with non-EU countries. To meet EU accession requirements, the UK would need to realign these processes with EU regulations and ensure that all contributions are calculated correctly. The UK would also have to implement robust auditing and reporting mechanisms to prove that its financial contributions are transparent and properly managed. The EU requires member states to have systems in place for monitoring financial transfers and ensuring that there is no fraud or mismanagement. And this is particularly relevant given that the UK has made regulatory changes since Brexit that affect how financial transactions and tax revenues are reported. The EU would expect the UK to restore full compliance with its financial oversight mechanisms, including cooperation with the European Court of Auditors. Another crucial aspect of this chapter is how EU funds are managed within member states. As a member of the EU, the UK previously had access to EU funding programs such as the Common Agricultural Policy and the European Regional Development Fund. If it were to join again, it would once again be eligible for these programs, but with eligibility comes responsibility. The UK would need to prove that it has the administrative capacity to properly manage EU funds, ensuring that money is allocated fairly and used efficiently. The EU strictly enforces financial accountability, and member states must have mechanisms in place to prevent misuse of funds and to report spending accurately. Post-Brexit, the UK has introduced alternative funding mechanisms to replace EU grants in part, such as the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is meant to substitute for EU regional development funds in part. If the UK were to join again, these domestic funding schemes would need to be reassessed, as they would once again be tied to EU budget allocations. And this could be a politically sensitive issue, as some regions and sectors that have become accustomed to new UK-specific funding programs may not want to transition back to an EU-based system. Another point of contention in this chapter is the impact on taxation policy. While the EU does not set direct taxation rates for member states, it does require that VAT systems are harmonized and that certain tax collection practices follow EU guidelines. Since Brexit, the UK has had more flexibility in setting VAT policies, including VAT reductions in certain sectors. Joining the EU again would require the UK to align its VAT systems with EU rules, which could mean reversing some post-Brexit tax decisions. The question of contributions to the EU budget would likely become a major political issue in the UK. One of the most controversial aspects of the Brexit referendum was the claim that leaving the EU would free up money for domestic spending, famously illustrated by the, let's say, misleading £350 million per week figure on the Vote Leave campaign bus. If the UK were to join the EU again, political opponents of EU membership would likely highlight the financial contribution required, arguing that joining again would take money away from national priorities. However, proponents of EU membership would counter that the economic benefits of being in the EU outweigh the financial contributions, as access to the single market increases overall economic growth and tax revenues. There's also the broader issue of the EU's long-term budget cycles. The EU operates on multi-annual financial frameworks, meaning that member states commit to funding agreements that last several years. If the UK were to join again, it would need to integrate into the system, potentially committing to financial contributions that extend beyond the term of any single government. This would require careful negotiation and long-term planning to ensure that financial obligations are sustainable and politically acceptable. Another important aspect is the ability to influence EU budget priorities. As a non-member, the UK currently has no say in how the EU budget is allocated. If it were to join again, it would regain the ability to shape budgetary decisions, including funding for research, infrastructure, and economic development. And this is a key argument for those who support EU membership, as it would allow the UK to advocate for its interests within the EU financial system rather than being an outsider affected by decisions made without its input. Ultimately, Chapter 33 is about financial responsibility, transparency, and cooperation. For the UK, completing this chapter would require significant adjustments in its financial governance, tax collection, and budgetary coordination. It's not simply about paying into the EU budget, but about ensuring that financial management systems meet EU standards. And if the UK is ever serious about joining again, it must be prepared to fully integrate into the EU's financial framework and accept the obligations that come with it. That's it for today's episode of BRITURN, and if you found this video informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below the video. How do you see the UK handling this chapter of the accession process? I'll see you in the next and soon, not last but last episode. See you next time, and one more video is right here in the end screen.